Hello everyone, and welcome to the world-renowned review of AMC's The Terror, Episode 6, entitled A Mercy. I am the world-renowned historian. First of all, as always, to everyone who has been watching these reviews and who is currently watching this one, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I genuinely do appreciate it. You know, I've really been enjoying talking to some of you in the comments, but if you're enjoying these reviews and you prefer to just lurk and not comment, like, that's awesome as well. You know, I'm glad you're here. So, that out of the way, let's get to the episode.
Delicious things to eat.
The popcorn can.
The theme of this episode is masks. Masks. What we show on the outside versus what we are hiding on the inside. Episode 6 begins 2 weeks after Blanky was attacked on deck by the Toonbuck. You know, we open with a very cinematic panning shot across the feet of the officers, all seated together in Erebus's captain's quarters. John Irving is reporting on the dwindling supply situation, and basically they're coming to the realization that they don't have a ton of time left. You know, and finally the camera finds Blanky's wooden leg, and we pan up to their faces. Irving reports that they've gone through all their tinned food, and they've thrown out all the spoiled cans. He says that it's clear now why Stephen Goldner's tinning operation was able to supply the expedition on such short notice with their canned supplies. It's because he did a shitty job. Meanwhile, Dr. Stanley appears to be having the best day of his life. In any case, at long last, let's at last talk about Stephen Goldner. On the 30th of June, 1813, a British engineer named Brian Donkin brought his canned beef to London for the British royal family to enjoy, including Queen Charlotte and King George III. Yes, King George III of the American Revolution. And enjoy it they did. Thus, canned food was born. Now, being as how the sun never set on the British Empire at the time, this was a real game changer for how the British could pursue their imperialist goals. No longer did sailors have to subsist on salted meat and hardtack. However, at the time, they used lead to solder the cans closed, because lead didn't run when it got hot. It was just considered a useful tool to work with, as its dangers to human physiology were only just beginning to become known. Stephen Goldner was born in Hungary around 1810, and he arrived in London in 1837, in his late 20s. Now, the immigration records list his profession as merchant at the time. His canning factory was in fact in Romania, where labor was much cheaper than Britain, so he was able to undercut pretty much all of his British rivals. The Franklin expedition was in fact only one among many contracts that Goldner was awarded. He and Franklin contracted for 8,000 tins of food on only 2 weeks' notice. This did not go well. In fact, much of the lead solder ran down into the cans like candle wax, and whatever food wasn't putrid was lead-laced. The archaeologist Owen Beatty, who exhumed the body of John Torrington on Beechey Island, determined beyond doubt that young Torrington was absolutely suffering from lead poisoning at the time of his death, though that was not the cause of his death. In the 1850s, Goldner was banned from ever supplying the Navy ever again, and in 1855, after really almost derailing the concept of canned food for all humanity, history loses track of him. Irving says that they'll run out of food midwinter next year if they're stuck in again, and he suggests that they go to 3/4 rations, but Fitzjames decides to go for 4/5. He also instructs them to tell the cooks to stop using the tinned food because they have to preserve all things portable. He's thinking of walking out of there. Yet again, Dr. Stanley is living his best life. After this, Fitzjames asks Blanky for a word in private. He wants to hear the real story of John Ross at Fury Beach, the one that Blanky referenced when he was holding down Crozier in his alcoholic fit. So Blanky has the line of the episode here when he says, and I'll try to do Ian Hart's accent, "Someone's going to have to think of a new kind of memoir, sir, if truth is what you're after." Ian Hart did it better. So Blanky tells the story, and this speech is incredible. Incredibly well written, wonderful, wonderful acting by Ian Hart. You know, really the only thing I can compare it to is and again, this comparison comes up, is Robert Shaw's speech near the end of Jaws when he and Hooper are comparing scars. We get lots of foreshadowing as Blanky tells Fitzjames the story, where he has this great line that in those harsh circumstances, your mind starts going unnatural, and he admits to Fitzjames that he fantasized about splitting John Ross's head open with an axe. Fitzjames even asks him if he would have done it, and Blanky's face tightens, just ever so slightly. Ian Hart deserves an Emmy for this performance. He talks about the darkness that can overtake a man in these conditions. Again, hard foreshadowing for later. A character we haven't met yet comes to interrupt them, but he stops when we hear Blanky bring up the notion of walking out of there. Now, Fitzjames asks if Blanky sees the darkness among them, and Blanky says that he doesn't need to see it to know that it's there. He suggests giving the men something in return for restricting their food, as a means of staving that darkness off. And that's about when Fitzjames discovers Sir John's box of carnival props, like costumes and masks and such. And then we get an image of Fitzjames holding up a mask and covering his face with it in the mirror. Like, if you think about it, we all wear masks, out in public in our everyday life. Some of these men are hiding roaring pain and anguish and fear, Blanky's darkness, behind a mask of naval duty. Crozier is convalescing, getting through his horrific battle with alcohol addiction, while Jobson combs his hair. Crozier asks him why he is combing his hair, and Jobson says, "Dr. McDonald will be here soon." Crozier replies that the doctor won't care about his hair, and Jobson's response kind of reinforces the theme of this episode. Turmoil on the inside doesn't need to show on the outside. Now, Jobson is so good at helping addicts that Crozier intuits that he's done it before, and Jobson tells this heartbreaking story about his mother's laudanum addiction, about how she got her hand crushed when she, took her 2 sons to the circus, and how the drug made her happy, and now he hates to hear a woman laugh. Crozier asks him how she did when she was through it, and Jobson makes this face. That face. Hickey pokes the dude who had his skull ripped off in the brain. Seriously, that's an entire scene. Now, I'm being silly, but Hickey's fascination with the man's exposed brain might be a bit of foreshadowing. Good Sir continues to observe Franklin's monkey, which he's probably killing with the canned food. Now, Hickey, while playing with a knife, talks to Gibson, and Gibson is still kind of under his spell and lets on that Irving had an inventory of empty trunks and bags and such, and Hickey realizes that they are counting the luggage, probably kind of intuiting that they're thinking about walking out of the Arctic. But right then, Le Viscount lets the men know that they're planning a carnival, and the men start getting hype! Like, if you think it's weird that, like, a bunch of military men and sailors are getting that excited about a carnival, it's the 19th century. I don't know. Like, what do you want me to say? Lady Silence is out on the ice, butchering a seal for its meat. Now, the sound effects in this scene are quite similar to those from when Hickey was poking the brain of the comatose guy. Make of that what you will. Next, we see Silence on her knees singing in some sort of ritual, with the remains of the seal, like, strewn about her. Now, I don't think it's a spoiler that it's probably safe to assume that this ritual involves the Toonbach in some way. Hickey and Thomas Hartnell are talking outside the ship as they set up a sledge. Hickey is working his manipulations to turn him against Crozier, while Hartnell seems determined to turn over a new leaf. Then, Jobson and Fitzjames are outside during the carnival preparations. The men set up the Union Jack and they cheer, and Fitzjames, completely in keeping with his character, the dashing war hero, he's cheered by this ritual. Jobson is concerned about the supplies they're burning through, but Fitzjames says they're almost certainly walking out in the spring anyway. And he says, "We need to give the men a last hurrah before we open their ears." And then he says, "Have you chosen a disguise?" Masks. The theme of this episode. They're all wearing masks. Hickey obviously is, with his manipulations and schemes. Even Fitzjames is, hiding the grim reality of the task to come, walking out of the goddamn Arctic, behind the facade of this carnival. And as we will find out soon, another character has been wearing a mask. Collins goes into the medical cabin where he finds Dr. Stanley. Colin says he was looking for Dr. Goodsir, and Stanley replies that he doesn't know where Mr. Goodsir is. Collins tells Stanley that his thoughts are going to a dark place, sort of like Blanky's darkness. Now, this is another masterfully written and acted scene, as the lamp sits right between the two men and Colin's face continually obscures the light, reinforcing the darkness theme brought up by Blanky in the opening. Colin says that he doesn't think the others feel as he does, and Stanley replies that he doesn't know how the others feel. Keep that in mind for later. Now, Stanley essentially tells him that he can't help him, and Collins asks Stanley if it's his daughter that he's drawing. And Stanley says yes it is, and he closes his sketchbook. Collins, pursuing the point, asks him if his daughter loves birds, and this reminded me of something that I heard about the space station in a documentary one time. Basically, they had a plant on the International Space Station, and all the astronauts got really obsessed with this plant. Like, they really wanted to, like, be the one to, like, feed it and take care of it. And, like, that was all they wanted to talk about was, like, how's the plant doing? Is the plant doing okay? And it was sort of this, like, connection to Earth, you know, this connection to the world, this connection to life. This is a very similar situation, I think. You know, the Arctic is as close as you get to outer space on planet Earth. So that's essentially the impulse that Collins was following. Then Stanley says this, which is darkly ironic in retrospect. You know, the Carnival does indeed sort them all out. Fitzjames is drunk and goofing around with a dress. There are two masks on the floor, and he sees a drop of blood fall on them. He first thinks he has a nosebleed, and then he realizes he's bleeding from his hairline, from his scalp. That is a symptom of scurvy, ladies and gentlemen. Next, Goodsir is summoned to find his monkey under extreme duress. It seems the monkey has not been enjoying the canned food. Next up, we get a scene between two characters whose names I missed, but I remember them from the book. It's a really kind of sweet story between, like, two gay intellectuals, kind of like a May December secret romance on the ship. The older one insists that his younger lover read Xenophon's March of the 10,000, which is a similar story to what the elder man heard from Blanky and Fitzjames' discussion earlier in the episode. Lady Silence is still singing, doubled over with exhaustion. And then we hear the toonbox nearby, so low at first that it might just be the wind. And she tells the toonbox that he needs to have a shaman near him. This is the clearest look we've gotten so far at the creature's face, and it has an almost like human quality to it. And Silence cuts out her tongue in a fairly gruesome scene, and just like we saw that her father's was cut out in the first episode. Crozier gets up looking for Jopson, but he's not there, as the men head out to the carnival. Goodsir examines the now dead monkey, finding the telltale signs of those black lines along his gums, which tell us that he had lead poisoning. Then we get Stanley getting ready to go out for the carnival, and Goodsir bursts in on him, and Stanley says, "Goodsir, where's the fire? Remember that for later." Crozier is out of bed at last, and he learns that the carnival is tonight. It will be going all night until the sunrise. You know, Crozier's not tip-top shape, he's not A+ shape, but he insists that his man helps him into his slops so he can go. The carnival is going until sunrise, and Crozier has been through his darkness, and he is experiencing his own personal sunrise. Goodsir explains the lead poisoning to Stanley, and Stanley tells him that he will decide whether to tell command. Now this pisses Goodsir off royally, and we see yet again that humanitarianism is really Goodsir's highest principle. You know, he is more of a doctor than Stanley is at this point, and he puts a little extra mustard on the word doctor, you know, when they're talking and when Goodsir leaves. And after he leaves, the camera lingers on Stanley for just a moment. Then the carnival begins. Fitzjames is dressed as a Roman centurion. Like, really, AMC? Are you kidding me? Like, you're gonna dress up Brutus from HBO's Rome like a Roman centurion. So the carnival is in, like, this tent complex, and they didn't play this up in the show, but in the book, this is supposed to be a recreation of Prince Prospero's castle from Edgar Allan Poe's Mask of the Red Death, with the multicolored rooms and such. Now, if you're not familiar with that short story, it's a quick read, and I strongly recommend it. But Crozier shows up and is blown away by the excesses of the production. You know, the men really sunk their teeth into this. Irving is drunk off his ass and singing, and we see Blanky drinking out of his fake leg. We see a depiction of the Toonbach carrying off and killing Franklin. Now, in the book, this enraged Crozier, but Jared Harris's Crozier kind of takes it in stride. We see a Zoe trope, which is one of those, like, rotating, like, old school, like, series of pictures with a light in the middle of it, and, like, you kind of, like, it kind of creates the vision of a movie just because, like, the images are rotating so fast. Anyway, we see a Zoe trope of a chopping woodsman, and then Crozier walks out directly above it, which is kind of funny because he cuts off the carnival immediately afterward. The Zoe trope probably has some significance that I'm missing. If you guys have any ideas about it, let me know down in the comments. Crozier then sees the hot tub, and that's where he's had enough. And Fitzjames tells him that it was his idea, that he allowed all this to get them ready to walk out. And Crozier tells Fitzjames to gather them up because they deserve to know the truth about this growing plan. So Crozier is about to rip Fitzjames' mask off. And we know from Blanky earlier in the episode, there is a mask hiding something dangerous, something dark. And the first thing Crozier says in his speech is, "Men, remove your masks." He essentially tells the men that it's time to go home. It's time to go back to all that they miss. Lady Silence shows up, and the woodsman Zoe trope appears again. Her face is streaked in blood from cutting out her own tongue. And, you know, this is another possible meaning for the woodsman, as that character features prominently in Western mythology and fairy tales, and the Toonbach features prominently in certain aspects of the mythology of the Inuit people. It's also interesting that Silence appears on screen as Crozier speaks the words, "I marvel at what you men have made." It's an interesting ironic indictment of the age of exploration, right? Like, for Crozier and company went into Silence's native land, woefully unprepared for the challenges they would face. She most certainly did not marvel at anything those men had made. As Crozier speaks, somebody inside opens the casks of alcohol as Lady Silence collapses in the tent from blood loss. You know, at the same time that Crozier is ripping off Fitzjames' mask regarding the necessity of walking out of the Arctic, the mask has fallen off somebody else. Now, this character seals up the tent as soon as he has poured out as much flammable liquid as he can. Crozier is in the middle of telling the men that they are hoping to run into the Netzilik people on their way down to the Hudson Bay Company's Fort Resolution. They are looking to walk 800 miles down Backsfish River. We see shots of the men as he speaks, and it's a little reminiscent of the shots from when Hickey was being whipped. You know, we see some who agree, like Blanky, and some who, frankly, maybe aren't so sure. And then we see Silence stumbling in, and Good Sir runs in to help her because she's got blood running down her face because she just cut out her own tongue. Good Sir is a good dude. And then Dr. Stanley sets the place on fire. Okay. When I first watched this episode, I thought this came completely out of nowhere. But then I watched it again, knowing the ending, and I caught that whole thread about the masks and everything they kept saying about Blanky's darkness all throughout the episode. This is goddamn masterful filmmaking. We get a really cool shot of Hickey silhouetted against the burning tent complex, dressed as Jack the Ripper. And then we get one of the most chilling scenes on film I've seen in a long time, as Dr. Stanley douses himself in oil and sets himself on fire. Blanky's darkness has claimed its first victim. The men flee the burning tents, but quickly find out that Stanley has sealed them off. But who saves the day? Why, it's Cornelius Hickey. He happened to be outside taking a piss, so he is in prime position to rip open the tents and get the men outside. Hickey cuts the tent open while dressed as Jack the Ripper, and accidentally knifes a guy, while dressed as Jack the Ripper. But he does save everybody else. Then the men are outside, saved by their great hero, Cornelius Hickey, watching their carnival burn. And then, at last, the sun rises. The post-carnival fire scene has red all over it. Fitzjames has a red cloth over his shoulder. Crozier picks up a red tapestry, half burnt. Basically, they lost both doctors in the fire, so Goodsir is now the high-ranking medical professional left on the expedition. The older fellow in the nice, gay intellectual subplot says he can help Dr. Goodsir. And the final two shots are Blanky, Collins, and Crozier looking at the sunrise. Crozier has had his sunrise. He's come through his addiction. Blanky described the darkness for the men. And Collins is still going through it, as he, went to Dr. Stanley about. He just didn't know that Stanley was going through it worse than he was when he described it to him. Alright, everybody, that's episode 6. I really loved it. If you reacted to it or you reacted to my take on it, get at me in the comments. Do all that good YouTube stuff. Like, dislike, comment, subscribe. You know the drill. You know what to do. Until next time, I am indeed the world-renowned historian. Be good, kiddos. I am out.